Hi, welcome back. We're in the second segment of Lecture 16, where we're talking about repeated measures ANOVA. And in the second segment, we'll talk about some of the risks and limitations of doing repeated measures. So I talked about the benefits in the first segment, and there are many, and we often try and employ repeated measures designs, but there are some complications. So of course, you have to think about order effects. Are there practice effects, as we saw in the working memory training experiment, for example, the control group? Are there fatigue effects? If so, then we need to think about some sort of counterbalancing scheme. And we'll talk about what counterbalancing means in this segment. There's also an issue that you have to think about with respect to missing data. So if you have one data point missing just think of your data frame, in a between subjects case, that's not really a big deal. It's okay if you have sort of a slightly different number of subjects in your groups. But if you're missing a data point with an individual subject, then that's going to throw off the whole calculation of the error term, right? Because it's A by S. So missing data is especially problematic in repeated measures designs. So we'll talk a little bit about the idea of missing data and how you might remedy the problem if you have a lot of missing data. So first, let's talk about counterbalancing. So let's start with the simplest case where you just have two conditions, A1 and A2. One approach is just called a block design. So subjects are just randomly assigned to one of two orders. They do all of condition A1 first and then all of condition A2 second, or the opposite. So you just have two order conditions. What that allows you to do, if you randomly assign the subjects to the two order conditions, is you could actually then conduct a 2x2 mixed factorial ANOVA, which we'll cover in the next lecture, to actually estimate to see if there are order effects. And you can evaluate that. That's one scheme. Another is called just a randomized design, where the conditions A1 and A2 are just presented to the subject randomly in a mixed fashion. So throughout the experiment, any sort of order effect should just wash out. So in some cases this is possible, but in other cases it's not. So it's a nice design if you can do it. Some cases they just have to do the whole condition in one sitting, and then the whole other condition in another. In that case, you do the blocked. But now let's suppose something a little more complicated, where you have just three levels of the independent variable. If you want to completely counterbalance, right, get every order in a block design, it's not just A1, A2, A2, A1, right? There's now 6 possible orderings. So to completely counterbalance, you would need 6 separate conditions. So again, subjects would have to be randomly assigned to each one of those conditions. And then if you really wanted to assess the order effects, you don't have to. You'd have to have a large number of subjects in each cell, right? So now the benefits are starting to fall away. And this accelerates quickly. So if you have 4 levels, then it's just 4 factorial. You would need 24 different orderings to completely counterbalance a repeated measures design with just 4 levels. And if you had 5, you need 120. So that just becomes impossible. So what's a classic approach in experimental design is to just use what's called a Latin squares design. And what that means is every condition appears in at least one position in the experiment. So let me just show you an example. So say we have 3 levels of independent variable A. So here's one solution. This isn't completely counterbalanced, right? Because there are actually 6 possible orderings. But this is sort of satisfactory because you'll see that A1 occurs first here, it occurs last here, it occurs second here, and so on. Every condition occurs in every serial position. So the order effect should wash out. It's not perfect, it's not a completely counterbalanced, but it's a solution that people often take because the number of orderings that you need in a Latin squares design is just equal to the number of levels of the independent variable. So here A was 3, so there's just 3. With 4, there's 4. 5, 5. So you don't get this sort of exponential increase. So finally, just missing data. There's really 2 issues to consider when you. This is particularly problematic when dealing with big data sets in applied settings where it's sort of hard to keep track of people if you're doing like longitudinal studies where people have to keep coming back. And there's 2 things to consider. One is just the relative amount. So relative to the total amount of data you have in your entire data structure, how many cells are missing? Like what percentage? If it's a pretty low percentage, then no worries. You can maybe drop them, or we can estimate values, and we'll talk about how to do that. If it's a large percentage, then you're in trouble, and there's not much you can do. And then the other thing to consider is whether there's a pattern. Is it just random? Some people just didn't show up for some sessions, and that's okay. Or is it more systematic? And is that introducing some bias into your experiment and your measurements? So I get this question a lot. I serve as a statistical consultant. I get this question a lot. How much is a lot of missing data? There's no real straightforward answer to that. So that's what I mean by no hard and fast rules. For me, a rule of thumb, and I review manuscripts for journals, and often they'll start out the results section by saying, we dropped 2% of the subjects because they failed to follow instructions in the task or something like that. If it's 2%, that's fine, right? We use alpha of 0.05 because we're okay with a type 1 error rate of 5%. So anything really under 10% doesn't raise a red flag for me. Once you get beyond that, you really start to wonder, well, what happened in this experiment? Why did so many people drop out? Or why did so many people fail to show up for this session? Or why did so many people fail to answer this question on a survey? That's a particularly interesting case of missing data, is when you do demographic survey type work, and if you ask sensitive information and people just they may not answer, then you might find patterns of missing data. Okay, so how do you find a pattern? It's actually really easy, and hopefully you should start to see how you could do this now that you've been through 6 weeks almost of statistics. So how could we figure this out? Real easy. So let's just say we have a variable that we're interested in, and we'll call it x. And we want to know, are the missing values on x, are they just random, or is there some pattern to them? What we can do is create a new variable in our data frame, call it xm. And if x is missing, set xm to 0. If x is not missing, set xm to 1. Then use xm as your independent variable and do a t-test to see if there's a difference on x. So is there something about these people that will allow us to predict whether they're missing or not missing? That's the way to do it. It doesn't definitely conclude that this is lawful, right? This isn't a randomized controlled experiment. This is just observational. So that's why in italics here, I said it may be lawful. But that's the approach to take. So what are the remedies if you do have a lot of missing data and you don't want to just drop cases? So that's the drastic case. If you have anything missing, just drop it so that you have a perfectly complete data structure. That's drastic. So I use only that if you can afford it. If it's easy for you to get more people or more data points, then fine. The more common thing to do is keep all cases and then try and estimate those missing values somehow. Right? We have the same subjects in each condition. We know how to do that, right? We know how to predict scores based on other scores, right? That's regression. So if subjects are consistent from one condition to another, that means there's a correlation. If we have a correlation, we can predict the score, right? So that's the regression-based estimates. First, you could just take the mean. Go back to regression. Remember, if you had no correlation, the best prediction was just the mean on that variable. So That's the conservative approach. It's not the greatest because if you have a lot of missing data and you just insert the mean, it's going to really cut down on your variance, right? Low variance, then there's going to be low covariance. There's not much information. So this is a better procedure, is use what you know about correlation and regression. Use a regression-based technique to predict the missing value based on the subject's scores and other conditions. That's a really cool way to go. It's a little controversial in some circles, and some confusion arises over, well, what variables did you use to predict that missing value? So if you do this, you just have to be very upfront and very clear about how you estimated missing values, because otherwise it comes across, of course, as unethical and cheating, right? You can't just plug in values, make up data, right? You have to have a sort of a meaningful approach, and you have to clearly articulate it to your audience, whether it's in a paper or in a presentation.